Heather, can I just say, it's a thrill to be able to meet you after reading your books, but also I don't get the chance every day to actually sit and have a chat with an international best-selling author. So this is a first in my life. Thank you very much.
First in mine too.
So we're just going to have a little bit of a chat today. I've got a few things that I'd like to sort of dig into and find out more about. But is there anything from a housekeeping point of view that we should touch on first, as far as if the audience has any questions while we're talking about the books?
Yeah, look, thanks, Melissa. Please, you folks in the back, I asked if we could stand, but in deference to our friend Aaron here behind the camera, he thought my jumping up and down would be a bit too much for him, so he did not accept that challenge. I would like to please ask you, if I'm saying something you want to know more about it, put your hand up and interrupt me. I think I can pick up where I left off. Might not, but it won't matter. So I don't mind being interrupted with the question at all.
You can't blame Heather for wanting to stand for a little while. She's just driven up from Brisbane in torrential rain all the way, no visibility, strange roads, strange car.
Yep.
You're a glutton for punishment, aren't you?
All of the above.
You know, I was nearly going to say when we started to have this conversation that I was really pleased that Anastasia let you in. But a little bird told me that you actually have relocated from Melbourne and are now living in the Sunshine State.
Yeah, well, she let me in, but she made me go into a hotel for 2 weeks and locked the door behind me. That was just last month, and on behalf of my hair and I, we are still trying to adapt to your weather, okay? So forgive us both. It's a little bit tawdry. Yeah, 2 weeks quarantine.
Okay, let's start by talking about Three Sisters.
Yes.
Because having read all 3 books, I would have to say that there's something, I loved all of them, but there's something very special about Three Sisters. And it's been described as a compelling story of survival through wits and willpower, luck, the protective bond of love and the power of a promise. And it's quite a remarkable bond that these women, yes, they are sisters, but not all sisters share a bond quite like that, to be able to come through something like that. So first of all, I guess I'd love to hear about how you came to know about the sisters.
Oh, there's a story in itself. I love it. If it's my books, there's a story behind the story. How lucky am I? And let me just say to anyone who is thinking about reading this, why don't you start at the back? Go to the back and look at the photos of the girls and their family. And then as you are reading, you'll get a feeling for who these incredible people are, because they were just ordinary people, ordinary girls who survived an extraordinary time in history. How did I get this story? I love it. Picture me, I'm in South Africa. I'm in this lovely little wine region called Franschhoek, just out of Cape Town. I'm at a book festival. And with book festivals, there's lots of authors and lots of drinking. And when you're in a wine festival, a wine area, you got it. I get back to my hotel room about 2 o'clock one morning, and I decide to have a look at my emails that have come through. There's an email there from a man called Odette. And he wrote telling me that he lives in Toronto in Canada. He had picked up a copy of the Tattooist of Auschwitz, and this is where the whole story actually takes a swing. Only 2 of those 55 countries that have published the Tattooist have taken the Australian cover. Every other one's different. Canada and Brazil have the Australian cover. He took the book that he picked up at Toronto Airport to visit his mother in Tel Aviv. He left it on her coffee table. At 93, she walked past, saw the cover, and simply said to him, "That must be about Lolly and Gita." And when he said, "How could you possibly know that?" She said, "Look at the number on the girl's arm on the cover. Now look at mine. They're 3 apart. Your Auntie Sibby's was just 2 away from Gita's. We went to school with Gita. We're on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. We're in Block 21 with Gita." So when you start reading that at 2 o'clock in the morning, no matter how much wine you've consumed, you do not sleep for the rest of the night. I emailed back within about 48 hours with several emails had passed us. Then I got the message saying that Livy, she's the 93-year-old at this point, she wanted to talk to me on the phone. So I'm now in Cape Town, so I ring up and have a chat to this lady who says, I need to tell you about Lily and Gita. And I went, that's wonderful. I'd love to be able to hear your story about them. She said, oh, but I don't like talking on the phone, so you'll have to come and see me. Okay, yes, I'd like that. We talked a bit more, and she just pleaded with me, I want to talk to you in person. So I wrote to my publishers in London, and I said, look, at some point I'm going to go to Israel. I want to meet this lady. Within about another day or two, I get a message from London saying, you're going directly tomorrow from Johannesburg to Tel Aviv. You are not returning home. I remember saying to Kate, she's my publisher in London, my main publisher, I said, oh, Kate, but I can't. She said, why not? I can see your itinerary. I know you're free. I said, no, Kate, you don't get it. I've run out of clean knickers. And she told me I had to learn how to shop or learn how to wash, whichever way. I was still flying to Tel Aviv. And I did the next morning, and into this strange country with a language I didn't speak, with none of the currency in my wallet. Finally, the taxi driver agreed to take me where I had to go after he dropped me off at an ATM in the middle of a desert and said, money. But I walked into the apartment and into the arms and into the lives of the Mala girls, Livy, Magda and Sibby. I was there for a week, but after about 4 days, all the family, 3 girls, had 2 children each. 2 boys, 2 girls, a boy and a girl. Everyone except for this one couple live in Tel Aviv, the couple in Toronto. They came in to meet me and just to talk about their mother and about the survival of the Holocaust. After about 3 or 4 days, one of them said to me, have you been to Jerusalem? And I went, no. Well, why don't you go? Right, yeah, next time I'm here. Why can't you go tomorrow? Well, it's too far. This is what you like when you live in Australia, isn't it? They all looked at me very weird and went, what do you mean? It's 40 minutes down the road. So I had no excuse but to go to Jerusalem for the day, and I'm glad I did. I spent the time at Yad Vashem, which is the largest Holocaust memorial in the world, and old Jerusalem, walking those streets where people have walked for centuries. The next day I get back to the house, the family got together in my absence, every single adult member, plus the little ones, 4 generations. And they say, would you please tell the story of these girls? So that's how it started.
It's incredible. How have the sisters reacted to the book?
The 2 sisters who are still alive, Livy's 95, and, she turned 96 last week. She could actually be 97 too. Yeah, it's all up for debate with people. And Magda's approaching 99. The reason I say that Livy may have just turned 97, well, she did. I was doing some research last year before the book, as I was finishing it, and I had my contact in Slovakia, in Larry's hometown of Krimpaki. I'm an honorary Krimpakian. I love to get back there and be with those people. But there's 2 people there who speak good English. One of them actually, she teaches it. She went to the town where the girls came from, and she was there looking at all their details of their births and the deaths and the marriages of their family. And there was lots of discrepancies she's finding, and one of them was, I cannot find Livia's date of birth. She's not written in the big journal. They're not computerised, folks. It's all just handwritten going back centuries. And I told her to keep looking, and she found that a year earlier than what Livy had said her date of birth was. And so I had to ring her up and say, sorry, darling, you're a year older than you thought you were. She said,
just whatever
I don't care, I'll take it. So they are still living independently in their own apartments. Magda's health's a little bit dodgy, but is approaching 99 or 98. She's allowed to be. But they're doing really wonderful. Sibby died in 2014, so I never got to meet Sibby, the oldest. You asked me how their family's taken the story. Right. Before this book went anywhere near major editors or printers, the manuscript got sent to the families. All adult, 3 generations had to read and approve the manuscript before it went anywhere. I remember saying to them when I sent it to them, it was a pass that my main editor had approved. And I said, look, don't worry about the spelling and the grammar and that. You're not there to read that. You're there just to tell me about the content. Two of them couldn't help themselves, and I got pages and pages back with them. You needed a comma on page 22. This is spelt wrong. It was hilarious. There was only one thing in that manuscript that I was asked to rewrite, and that request came from Livy and Magda themselves. And we'll get around to it when I'm talking about the story, because it's a lesson for authors who are writing true stories, and how not to let your own personal emotions interfere with the story you've been charged to tell.
So, okay, I don't want to be a spoiler.
Spoilers are good.
And I guess we don't want to give too much away for anyone here who hasn't read the book as yet. And if you were hoping to read it from the library, I'm sorry, I've had it at my place. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the sisters and what they've been through?
Absolutely, and I am going to give away a spoiler. It's in the first 2 or 3 pages. So even if you were looking in a bookstore thinking, do I want to read this or not, you'll probably have read it. The whole premise of the story is based on a promise that these 3 girls made to their father when they were very young, 3, 5, and 7. Livy tries to tell me she remembers making that promise to Papa, and Magda beats her around the head and says, of course you don't, you're only 3. What she remembers is being told about it nearly every day of her life. For her, that's the same thing. And this promise to their father was that they would always stay together. They wouldn't let anything separate them, that they would be the strongest staying together. They did not know and could not know that their father would die the next day. So there's the first spoiler. From there and that promise, I just take you straight, that was 1929, straight to 1942. And the eldest and the youngest being taken to Auschwitz. They didn't know where they were going. Now, the story has a dual sort of narrative playing out in the same timeline, because Magda, 17, the middle, she was in hospital. She had a bit of a fever. The local Christian doctor came to her house and said to their mother, I don't like what I'm hearing with what's happening to young Jewish boys and girls in Slovakia. Where's Sibby? Sibby's in the forest. She's training. She wants to be a soldier and go to Palestine, go to the promised land. That's what Sibby wants to do. Livy's 15 at home. Magda's 17. The mother and the doctor think, well, if you put her in hospital, she's fine. She'll be safe. And they surely wouldn't take a 15-year-old. How wrong they were. Sibby came home in time to say to her mother she's not going on her own. Only Livy's name was written down by the Hlinka Guards, who are the Slovakian version of the SS. But she didn't go alone. Sibby went with her. So for 2.5 years, Sibby and Livy are in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Magda is back in Slovakia with her mother and grandfather, and hiding until, of course, she got caught. And she then ended up in Birkenau, not knowing her sisters were there, but that they found each other in this god-awful place, the most evil place on earth. 100,000 men and women, boys and girls there, but they reconnected. They were together until taken on a death march. Now, I'd like to talk about the death march more later on, maybe, because it should be a book on its own. And there's more about that death march, which I can elaborate on that's even in the book. Their survival of that, their return to Slovakia, and then their subsequent move to Israel, Palestine, Israel, at that pivotal point in history when that nation state has been created. And you get to read what it was like for young girls at that time, not through the eyes of the military and the United Nations and the politicians. The academics and the historians, they got that covered. You got to find out what it was like for young girls and some significant people they connected with.
One of the things I think that's really remarkable and that just shines out through all the darkness in the book is not just the raw courage of these three young girls, and they were so young to be in that situation, but the selflessness. You know, Sibby looking after Livy, or who she called Kitten.
Yeah.
Everything they did, every decision they made, every step that they took, no matter how scared they were, revolved around that, not just the promise to their father, but their genuine love and intent to protect each other, didn't it? It was, I guess you look at relationships these days and you sort of think, if that were me in that situation, would I be able to manage it? Would I be able to handle it the same way? Would I do those same things? Would I make those same decisions?
Yeah, we're lucky that we'll never ever get to make those decisions. And in saying that, I always want to preface that with, and do not judge them or anyone else who survived that place for what they did do. Yes, Livy was the baby, the kitten. She was so tiny, as you read in the book. To keep her warm one winter, her sister found a baby's bonnet and it fitted on her head. But this has been the beauty of when I've spent so much time now with the families and seen videotapes too that they made some 25, 30 years ago with the Shoah Foundation, how that they took turns in being the one to keep the other one going. Yes, Sibby started out as the eldest, of being that person who kept Livy alive. But what happened when Sibby got typhus and Livy, still only now at 16, she had to now take that caring role. And when Magda joined them, well, I call Magda the keeper of the memories, because what she brought to them was the memories of their home in Slovakia, because she'd most recently been there. And she kept them going by reminding them of their life back in Slovakia. So, and that's how it's played out to this very day. Livy's still, and I see her at 95, 96, saying, what about me? I'm the baby. She still wants to pull that role, you know. Look at me. Very much so. Magda, the quiet, the reserved, thinks before she speaks, just the same.
So, what do you believe the sisters wanted your readers to know? In the family suggesting that you share their story, what was it important for them to have your readers know?
Same thing that Lully did too, by the way, which was if people hear about our stories, then maybe it will never happen again. It's interesting that they're living in a country where conflict has not gone away. But as Livy says, we have soldiers, we have airplanes, we'll be fine. And during that conflict earlier this year, when they were anything but safe, the younger generation chose to leave Tel Aviv. Yes, they were taking small children with them. Livy and Sibby and Magda stayed in their apartments. They would not leave their home. Magda, she made one concession. She said, when the air raid sirens go, she said, I will go and stand in the corridor outside my apartment where there's no windows. But in terms of how did they stay together, what do they want you to take away from their story? That we don't know ourselves until we're tested. We don't want to look for being tested. But if we are, believe in yourself and believe in your ability to find the courage, the resilience, and the love in somebody else. I'm not talking romantic love here like Lully and Gita. This is sibling love, the unconditional love that you come from siblings. I really think that my brothers know me better than my husband of 40 plus years and my kids. Connect at a different level.
So going back now to, you mentioned before about the death march, and as you say, it's often touched on in other stories that you read, but no one goes into any great detail about it, do they?
No, so many books end Auschwitz stories at the liberation. Mine goes way beyond that, not only the death march, but back to Slovakia and then to Israel. Here's something that's, well, I think it's alluded to in the very last page of the book. That death march didn't last days or weeks, it was months. Those girls got taken out of Auschwitz on the 18th of January 1945. I know the exact date that they ran away from the Nazis, from the SS, the 30th of April. And in that period, they were taken from one camp to another as the SS tried to get them out of Poland into Germany, just trying to get away from the Russians who were advancing. Now, they've told me an incredible story of their survival of that death march, the towns they were in, the people they met along the way. You know, one day they're being threatened by the Germans, and the next it's the Russians, and then it's back to the Germans. There's air fights going on overhead all the time. When I was with them in January 2020, I was back in Israel just before the world went to kaput. And sitting with Magda and Livy and the family one day, and Magda said, I wrote a diary, you know, during the war. At which point everybody, including Livy, turned to her and said, you did? Where is it? She didn't know. I asked the family if they would look. About 2 weeks before this book was to go to the printers. 2 weeks. So it's all locked up and, you know, it's in typeset. It's good to go. I get a frantic call from Israel. We've found Magda's diary. And we have now, and what we do with it, and by we I mean the family and maybe my publishers, is yet to be decided. We're just holding on it. 80 pages of handwritten notes, written in real time by Magda. In one of those camps, she stole a journal, a notebook, and some pens. And her first entry is the 30th of April, 1945. And then, and for the next nearly 3 months, she documents each day where they are and what's going on. So while I've been able to tell you about it in broad terms, we now know the exact dates and the exact times, the towns they were in and where they were and what was going on. We know the names of the Dutch, or the number of the Dutch prisoners that they found who died and they buried in some small little town. And the United States Holocaust Museum and database are now trying to track that man through his number to be able to find his family. He was Dutch, we know that, and we now have his number, Auschwitz number, and we'll be able to tell his family if we can find anyone living exactly where their ancestor is buried in this tiny little village in Germany. We managed to get one page. By the way, when we got this and the family found it, I said, what does it say? What does it say? And they all went, how the heck do we know? We don't speak or read Slovakian. Beautiful handwriting, but all in Slovakian. So it was sent to me, and I had a Slovakian translator in Sydney translate it all. In the very, very back of the book, we managed to sneak in a copy of the handwritten in Slovakian entry for one particular entry and the translation. That's the 8th of May, 1945, and I just get really, when I think of it, it's the day the girls were told the war is over. You can read what Magda has to say about that. But there's way more to come on that story.
But even that, the resourcefulness and the courage to be able to to write that diary, because basically in those camps, she could have been shot, couldn't she, for having pen and paper?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. No, she got it, and she then continued to write right up until they're getting back into Slovakia. And then it went missing for 77 years.
Amazing. You didn't set out to write the story of the Holocaust, did you? Back when, with Tattooist of Auschwitz, you wanted to write Holocaust stories as experienced by individuals who survived it. So how do you choose whose stories to tell?
See, that's not quite correct either. I was at that point in life where my kids stopped saying to me, Mom, can you drive me somewhere? It was now, Mom, can I have the car keys? And I'd had that moment where I went, okay, this is good. They're all alive. So far, none of them in jail. Maybe it's time for me. What do I want to do? And I always thought I could write the great movie. I love movies. I need to know if there's a theatre here in Hervey Bay, because if there is, I'm going to go there tonight.
There's two.
Excellent, excellent. So I started learning on weekends and on courses you can do online how to write a screenplay. I never considered I could write a book. That was way out of my league. But the thing about writing a screenplay, for anyone who's interested in writing, you can learn it because it has a formula. It's got rules. And you don't get to deviate those rules unless you're Quentin Tarantino. He does. He has 4 acts. Everybody else is only allowed 3. But there's really strict rules. And what it taught me, and anyone who does learn it, is structure. It says very clearly in your first 10 pages, you must have got this and this in your story down. And then the end of the first act, all very structured. I'm not really a structured person, but that really resonated with me. Easy way to do it. Every movie ever made, going back to Charlie Chaplin, you can get the script for that free of charge from one of the several websites in the US. Download it. A 2-hour movie will take you about 1.5 hours, 2 hours to read. That's how quick they are. Read your favourite movie. Read the script. Then watch the movie. See where the two part. There'll be deviations because these people called actors and directors come along and play with the words. It's for screenwriters struggled over. And then watch the movie again. And that's how I learnt to write a screenplay. I was having a cup of coffee with a friend I hadn't seen for several months. And she just casually said to me, "I got a friend whose mother's just died. His father has asked him to find someone he can tell a story to. That person can't be Jewish. You're not Jewish. Do you want to meet him?" I went, "What's his story?" And she said, "I don't know." And I went, "Oh, never mind. Yeah, I'd like to meet him." And it was a week later that I met Lali Sokolov. And I was incredibly embarrassed and humiliated to have to admit to him how my small town New Zealand education had taught me so little about the Holocaust. I don't know if there's any Kiwis here, but kia ora if there is. But World War II, unless the New Zealand Army was taking part in it, we didn't hear about it. But that made me the perfect person to tell his story. He wanted somebody who wasn't Jewish because that person would have no backstory of their own, no family history. So no, I didn't have an interest in the Holocaust. I was ashamed how little I knew. I now know a heck of a lot more. So that's how I got Lali's story, by being with him for 3 years. And I just thought that I was going to spend time with this incredible man who was living history, folks. Oh my gosh, when you sit down with somebody like him and the girls and you hear them talking about, events that you've only read about in books or seen in movies, it is incredibly humbling. My life working in a hospital in Melbourne for 20 plus years in the social work department, if nothing, it taught me, along with my great-grandfather, how to listen. Because all I did was sit and listen to Lali for months, 2 to 3 times a week. I never took notes, never had a recorder. I just sat listening, wondering if there was going to be something I could write up for his family for the generations to come, not knowing the depth of his story until he stopped saying to me every time we met, "Hurry up and write my story, I need to be with Gita." He stopped saying that. His doggies then accepted me throwing the tennis ball. And Lali started telling me his story with all the emotional and horrific elements to it.
Given how many hours you spent in Lali's company and listening to all of those stories, and there's a lot of darkness, there's a lot of confronting things that are part of that. How did you deal with that after you came away from those visits? How do you process all of that? How do you compartmentalise? How do you switch those things off?
One of the things about the job I had, we knew that every day we were going to meet people who were only in front of us because something tragic or traumatic had happened to them. That's why they were in the hospital I worked in, Monash. It was a big hospital. And so we knew that we can only help them, if at all, by not getting caught up with their trauma, their tragedy. And so I had that already. However, my work there it changed every day. The people in front of me were different every day. There's a phrase that's used often in mental health, between mental health professionals, and when they're dealing with people with traumatic experiences, and it's called transference. I did not initially become aware that Lully was doing that to me. I could see that he was changing. I could see that he was now much lighter in his approach to being with me. He's skipping around his lounge room. He's singing. He's wanting to go out to coffee shops. I let him drive me once. That was enough. He's wanting me to go out to social events with him, and I did, and he called me his girlfriend. He was coming home to my place and engaging with my family, flirting terribly with my then 18-year-old daughter. And that's when it started landing on me even more. And it was only when my family complained one day, "Mum, what's going on? You used to come home from being with Lully and we'd ask you, 'How's Lully?' And you would tell us, you'd give us bits of stories." And I apparently switched to just saying, "He's fine." "Yeah, but what's going on?" "Nothing, he's fine." And I became aware when I spoke to a colleague, gosh, they're good having colleagues in the mental health profession, who looked at me and she slapped me around the head and she said, "Oh, for goodness sake, it's a classic case of transference, Heather. Now get over it. You know, it's not your pain, it's not your guilt, it's not your trauma. You do not get to own any part of it. Now, find a strategy to cope." So my strategy was, after I left Lully, he used to boast that he would see me to my car every time we left. That meant kissing me goodbye on both cheeks at his door. He was on the first floor apartment of a block. His balcony overlooked the street where my car was parked. And so while I went down that flight of stairs and up the little path to my car, he and the doggies ran to the balcony, and he'd be leaning over the balcony. "I see you to your car." So knowing he was watching me meant I had to drive away. So what I would do is literally drive 200 metres round the corner, park in a quiet street. Yeah, you got it. Just sit there, all by myself. Occasionally I put music on. More often than not, I didn't. And just what I call centre myself. So I could go home and be, the wife and the mother that I needed to be. Plus, I had him. Whenever I wrote something that got me really upset, I'd go around to him and he'd give me a cuddle. He ended up supporting me emotionally more than I was him. He goes, I'm here. They're not, but I am.
Lully loved women, didn't he?
Oh, yeah.
He had eyes for no one but Gita.
Until he met my 18-year-old daughter.
When you're fictionalising history, you talked before about there's a formula that you work to with screenplays, etc. But when you're writing something like these three books, and you've got to find that mix between relating the personal experiences, the personal stories, but also the research and the realities of history. How do you blend those?
I use that tiny creative part of my brain. I could not write a story or create a story on my own, trust me. However, I'll give you another example. I actually call it reimagining it. Maybe that's just me being hoity-toity, I don't know. And I'm going to use the example, now I think about, of those girls making a promise to their father. When I was talking to them about it, and I spoke to them about it several times when I've been with them, what can you tell me about it? Magda, you're the one that was 5, you remember it. What can you tell me about it? And she just went, no, I don't know, I can't remember. I just know we did because it was the last time we saw Papa. So I said to her, okay, tell me about your home in Vranov. And she described, she and Livy, because Livy, they were living there until they were teenagers. They described a very humble home of 1 bedroom they shared with their mother, and their grandfather slept in the broom closet, they giggled. And it had a tiny little kitchen and a couple of a table and some chairs to sit in, very modest. And then Magda piped up and went, oh, but remember, Livy, in the backyard, there was an oleander tree there and it kept wanting to die. And Mama wouldn't let it. Every winter, it tried to die on her. It was grandfather used to joke with her, that it's going to outlive all of us. And Livy then went, I remember. She said, and I remember the gate and the back fence. She said it never got fixed, and so when the wind blew, it used to bang and wake us up at night. So I'm sitting with the 94 and 96-year-olds hearing these stories and hearing their memory. I need to write the scene about the promise to the father. I now have got 2 potential places to put it in. I chose to reimagine that scene out in the garden with the oleander tree and the slamming gate. So when I fictionalise my stories, I take the story, the vignette given to me, and reimagine the setting. I don't have to do much reimagining in Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's all there for me. But I can reimagine the people around them and maybe what else is going on, because I do now have a very good understanding of the timeline in that place. And if there's one thing you don't get to bugger around with, and that's the timeline of the Holocaust.
Did you ever imagine, right from when you penned The Tattooist of Auschwitz, that these books would be as incredibly popular as they've been?
Not in my wild, never went there.
Why do you think it is?
I was with Lully 2 hours before he died. And I knew he wasn't going to see the sun come up the next day. And when I kissed him goodbye, the last thing I said to him, it was on the 31st of October, 2006. I will never, ever stop trying to tell your story. So it existed as a screenplay for some 12 years until I was visiting my brother and sister-in-law in San Diego, California, complaining about those buggers 100 miles up the road in Hollywood who wouldn't know a decent story if it hit them over the head. And yeah, we'd probably had a couple of red wines that night too. So my sister-in-law looked at me and went, oh, for goodness sake, write the bloody thing as a book and get on with it. Okay, yep, that was a bit of a slap around. So to me, keeping my promise to Lully was to then write the book, or write a book, print 100 copies, self-publish, and give it away to some friends. There was never any intention or thought that the age of 65, when I should be retiring and plan to retire, that I would then have this novel be published the way it has. No, that was not even wildest dream stuff.
Apart from the remarkable links between the characters in the books, there are the universal themes, aren't there, of love and courage and hope. Do you think it's those things that make them as hugely popular as they are? Yes, and also the stories, I'm told the way I've managed to write it, because, by the way, when I did get a publisher, and there's another story and how I got that too, and they said to me, oh, it's a memoir, you must write it as a memoir. And I went to memoir school for a day. It was a 5-day course. I knew I couldn't tell his story as a memoir or a biography in any of those non-fictionalised ways. I'd heard this story from Lully, the words, and I had his story. I needed to tell it in his voice. So after several attempts at me, we'll write it in the third person then. What's that mean? I had no idea. When you're dealing with very significant 200-year-old publishers in London who are trying to deal with a never-written-before author who doesn't seem to realise that in one sentence she's able to go from writing in the first person to the second to the third and then back to the first. It was quite a challenge for them. And then one day, Kate just rang me up and she said, oh, just write the book, would you? So why I think it has been a success is, A, I didn't know what I was doing. B, I wrote it in Lully's words. And I'm talking about young people of whom we all can relate to. 9-year-olds have written to me who have read that book. Next semester in January in the state in New South Wales, it will be required reading on the education board there for every kid, 13 and 14-year-old in that state. Yeah. And I've spent time in Sydney with the education department there, recording podcasts and videos, talking to teachers, helping teachers with the storyline and students, and I will visit as many schools as I can as well. And by the way, am I waving my hands around too much for you? Yeah, I do care a bit. So
I think what I have are relatable characters, because we were all young once. I can vaguely remember it. But those young kids, the teenagers of today, they totally get it. When I'm talking to them in schools in Britain or here in the US, they ask the best questions. And they are so engaged because they think, oh my gosh, that's my age. Relatable, I think is the word. I could be wrong.
Well, now that you're a Queenslander,
Yeah. Is there a
you need
special
to
way
have a
talk?
chat. You need to have a chat to the education minister here.
Yes. Bring her on. Him, her, I don't know. But I'm hoping that it'll spread from just New South Wales. Victoria have been given a bit of a boot up the bum and said, but they missed their mark now that I've left them.
Do share the publisher story. I'm sure we'd all like to hear it.
How I got a publisher? I'm an old fart. I determined that I do not have time for rejection letters. That's what they call them when you send a letter out to a publisher saying, hey, I've got this great story and you really want it. They'll wait 6 months and they'll send you what's called a rejection letter. I was talking to my oldest son, and he dabbles in filmmaking. Many years ago, he and his partner, not his life partner, his working partner, making a short film. They needed some money. They were the first, you've heard of crowdfunding? Right. They were the first Australians to do a crowdfunding request on Amazon in the US. They have this big crowdfunding platform called Kickstarter. So they were the first Australians. Not only they got the money, they got 3 times the amount of money that they actually wanted. We then had a problem getting it into Australia because Amazon realised, hang on, we haven't got any facility to pay money into Australia. So a younger brother who had worked it there, he was sent there for 24 hours to get a driver's license at my brother's address, open a bank account so that big brother could get his money. But what he said to me, the best thing about that crowdfunding campaign they did was how their story got alerted to the world. And he said to me, Mum, why don't you give it a go? So I sat down in my home and hubby put the camera on, not as fancy as this one, and I just had a 3-minute chat about the story. I plagiarised some film from the archives, plagiarised some beautiful music, and 3-minute little video I put up on Kickstarter. It's still there. You can still see it. They never take them down. Publishers came to me. Never got a rejection letter.
Brilliant, good stuff. See, who says you can't teach an old dog new tricks?
Yeah. I'd never heard of crowdfunding until some did it.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So, having published Lali's story and then deciding what you were going to move on to next, how hard was it then? You've talked to us about when you'd leave Lali and you'd drive around the corner and sit quietly and gather your thoughts or not think about the things that you just talked about for so long. How hard was it then to step into writing another book that was still about Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Holocaust,
and the gulags?
And the gulags, yeah.
Yeah, Lali had made me promise so many times I was getting tired of hearing him. When you finish telling my story, and he'd wag his finger, that's probably why I do it, and only when you've told mine, then you must tell the world about Silka, the bravest person. And he'd wag his finger again and go, not the bravest girl. I go, oh yeah, don't be sexist, Lali. The bravest person I ever knew. You've got to tell the world about her. Well, when I did get a publisher to tell Lali's story, I only got a 1-book deal. That's all they offered me. They didn't know where this was going to go. So that's why I peppered her in Lali's story, because I knew about her from him. I knew about her from reading other testimonies of survivors. I knew about her from hearing Geeta on her 2-hour show a videotape talk about her. And so I started researching Silka. I put enough of her into Lali's story, and what I hoped would happen did happen. People all around the world started writing to me and the publishers, what happened to Silka? I've been Googling Silka and I can't find out anything. I want to know more about Silka. So they went, all right, You got another deal. I now get 2 book deals, but still we were just doing the one at a time then. So telling her story, I met survivors in Melbourne and Sydney who knew her. Her time in the gulags in the Soviet Union, where she was, Vorkuta, it's about 140 kilometres inside the Arctic Circle. It's the coldest goddamn place on earth. Well, I got a professional researcher from Moscow and said, find out everything you can about Vorkuta. Only Vorkuta. Do not scramble my brain with other gulags. So she got me all that, the information, photos, testimonies, documents galore. I now could form a picture. I then went to Slovakia and with my friends from Krempaki, went to Košute, where Silke had lived for nearly 50 years, into the apartment building where she'd spent all those years. The people now in her apartment let me come and sit in her apartment. Their 93 and 95-year-old Mr. and Mrs. Samueli next door. They knew I was coming. It was all arranged in advance. They invited me in there, and for hours, these incredible people who live in that apartment building came in to Mr. and Mrs. Samueli's apartment to share their stories of Silke. You know, people in Slovakia don't live like we do. They don't live at home and then go out flatting and then may buy a house and then they upsize, downsize. You know what we do. They get given a place, more often than not just an apartment, and they're there ready for life, which is why these people from as young as 30 and 40 to their 90s could come and meet with me. They never spoke English, I never spoke Slovakian. And still, for a whole day and half a day the next, we sat there. I had 2 translators, by the way, and they just sort of asked my questions and whisper in my ear and take notes, because I don't take notes. If someone's talking to me, I want to be able to, look at them and let them know that I'm hearing them, even if I don't understand a word they say. But when it came to writing her story, all I can say is the husband and the dog had a hard time. I had no one to yell at, and so they copped it.
Speaking of your husband, I believe at some stage I did read somewhere that he asked you, should he be jealous of this Lali fellow?
Yeah.
Because you spend an inordinate amount of time with him.
Well, and then they got to know each other, and Lali would always walk in the door, and 9 times out of 10 he would find Steve cooking, which my kids had already told him was a good thing. You really don't want to have mum's cooking. And he would just go up to him, she may still be your wife, but she's still my girlfriend,
I love it. Back to Silke. I think it's inconceivable that someone can survive Auschwitz and then have to be sentenced to, what was it, 13?
It was 15 years 15 she was sentenced to, but she served 10. Utterly. And for me to hear 50, 60 years later from these people who had known her so long, what an incredible woman she was, what a loving, beautiful, the best neighbour in the apartment building she was. How she did not allow all that horror that had been depicted on her determine who she was. She never had any children. We can only presume it was as a result of her abuse. And I'm going to touch on that again in a sec. But she was considered to be the mother to every child in that apartment. And I met 50-year-olds who said she was my second mother. Particularly in winter, they said we would come home from school, and if our parents weren't home and we were locked out, Silke every day was waiting at the bottom of that apartment building. It's about 12 stories high. And she'd be there waiting to see who couldn't get in. And she would then take them into her apartment and give them warm drinks and keep them warm, because every one of those parents knew whose door to knock on to find their child when they came home from work. And that went on for decades.
You mentioned before that we should never judge what anybody did to survive the Holocaust, and that's never more relevant than it is with Silke's story, is it?
Mm. Absolutely. And yeah, I've been kind of both praised and pillared for, someone said to me, having the courage to write about her abuse. I don't call it courage, I call it my shame. Because when we started looking at how we were going to tackle her physical and sexual abuse, knowing that there would be detractors out there, and they could more than likely to come from the Jewish community, the academics and historians who have recorded this period. We had to consider, well, how are we going to handle this? And thankfully, my publishers agreed with me. No, I'm going to call it for what it was. A spade is a spade is a spade. So then we started looking at what other research and literature we could find to support what we were about to start writing about. The literature that we found touched on it and said it has been considered that this part of survival of the Holocaust, or not surviving, will not be dealt with because we do not want to shame those girls and women for whom this evil was perpetrated on. They didn't want to shame them. It's our shame that we allowed these women to carry for decades the horror, the truth of their survival. And then we found documents, well, not documents, but research papers in Canada, where a couple of psychiatrists there had been called into nursing homes and retirement homes where elderly women were now living who, because of degrees of dementia or whatever, had lost their filter. And they were horrifying and shocking their family and their carers as they were now openly talking about their sexual abuse as young girls in the Holocaust and the times of war and conflict everywhere. So I decided, no, we're going to say it and call it out. All I can say is I am incredibly proud when I have been in the United States in particular talking about Silke, because I managed to do a good book tour of that before COVID. And when I'm talking about Silke and her story alone, and I start talking about this, and I remind people, the Me Too movement came about only a few years ago when educated celebrity women who had been shamed for years into keeping quiet said no and stood up. If it took these educated celebrity women years of shame to be able to speak up, well, what chance did these young girls ever have? They had none. So I'm kind of doing it on their part. When I start telling this, I'm often overwhelmed when at some point, and you know, my publishers say 99 times out of 100, it's a man that stands up in the audience and starts applauding and says, thank you for telling the stories of what have been perpetrated by other men. So yeah, I get a bit crusadey here. No, I'm sorry.
Please do. It's about time patriarchy got a shake up.
Yeah, and I'm not in any way attacking even in some ways the men who perpetrated these crimes, because we'll never know who they are. I'm just angry that we allowed it to be covered up for so long. That's all.
I think the thing that it's really difficult to wrap your head around as you read the books, and in Silke's story, but in the Three Sisters as well, is that they can come through all of that and still have the positive attitudes. Like in the last part of the Three Sisters, where the family gets together and all the little jokes and jibes and little comments about that allude to their experiences, but the way that they can express it and be so comfortable with doing that is mind-boggling.
Yeah, some of the jokes I hear those families in Israel say, or some of the comments they say, I initially go, ooh, and then I realise, no, that's their way of coping. That's their way of living with what their mums, and by the way, their dads too, because all the girls married other Holocaust survivors. And telling their story, and we'll go jumping back to that a little bit, one of the other things that has come about from my recording the book into the story, my book, their story, all of them, is how those sisters then also revealed things to me that they hadn't to their own children. And so this has been a journey for the children of the particularly, and I'm going to share one of them because we now, the children know. I call them kids, by the way, and they're my age, but these are the kids of the girls. They're two of them, their fathers, Sibby's husband and Magda's husband. They had had previous wives and children who had been lost in the Holocaust. Their children, Sibby and Magda, did not know that. That was one of the things that had never, ever been spoken about. And these children, that's the two boys of Sibi, Kari and Yossi, and the two girls of Magda, Haya and Diti, they are now trying to find information about the possible half families that they have out there and working really hard. Archives do exist. You can find things. And only last week I got something from Livy's daughter saying we're going through archives all around the world, but guess what we found? We found the ship's log with the names of the people who were on the boat when Livy and Magda made that journey from the Black Sea in Romania to Haifa in Israel. They found the log, and there are the two girls' names. And they also found the name of Livy's husband, because he was also on that boat. The boat was called the Transylvania, and it arrived in Israel, in Haifa, on the 29th of February 1949. So roughly, nearly 8 weeks after Israel had become its independent nation state.
That's right. Livy's husband was one of the Peacock boys?
Yes, a Peacock boy he was called. They didn't meet on the boat, though they saw each other on the boat. The fact that when they did meet 2 or 3 years later, and they were able to go, hang on a minute, yeah, you were one of the Peacock boys, she said to him. That was a bunch of boys, young boys, on the boat they were with, because there was hundreds of young Jewish boys and girls. And they were, about a dozen of them, they were preening and propping around the boat because they were going to be joining the newly established, or being part of establishing the Israeli Air Force. They were all potential pilots and engineers.
Any flyboys here? No?
And he did, by the way, work for El Al Airlines all his life.
It's remarkable. Is it safe to say that their families are now part of your family?
Livy asked if she could adopt me. I have said no, but I'm so touched that all these children, and they write to me, I hear from at least one of them most days, Haya yesterday, and they write, dear sister. So to say I'm part of their family, absolutely.
That's wonderful. When
Livy's granddaughter got married in Israel last month in October, I was in quarantine. I tried to get there to go to the wedding, but the Australian government wouldn't let me out and the Israeli government wouldn't let me in. So I negotiated with them. I didn't negotiate. I asked them, I said, look, if at my expense and to the bride and groom, who I know, you will end up with a very, very nicely produced video of your wedding, but can I send along a film crew, and film your wedding, but not only film it all, but live stream it back to me. So I was lying on my bed in the Pacific Hotel here in Brisbane, watching a live stream of this incredible wedding.
You're into all this tech now, aren't you? I mean, that first crowdfunding, it's just been non-stop.
I know. I can do Zoom. I hate Teams. I always seem to bugger that up.
You, Tattooist of Auschwitz was published in 2018. We've got now 3 Sisters in 2021. Mm-hmm. That's a very small window, isn't it, to be able to create these 3 amazing stories.
There's another one that kind of slots in there, came out last year, but it's non-fiction. It's my attempt at telling you a little bit about how I got the stories and a little bit about who I am. Not too much. You're not going to get to know too much. But I did write a non-fiction book called Stories of Hope. And in there I relate how I was able to get the stories, how this incredible great-grandfather I had taught me as a young girl how to listen. He was the only adult in my life growing up who not only spoke to me, but then listened to me, and the role he played in my life. And how I got a couple of snippets in there from my work in the hospital. Of course, that generally is not something you talk about. I was able to write those up. But that's a little book. So yeah, I did 4 books in under 4 years. That's what happens when you're getting older. You haven't got all the time in the world.
No. Look at Magda and Livy. You've got loads of time.
Oh, I hope.
Speaking of them, and if we can just rewind again back to the Death March, One of the things that intrigued me was when they came upon, and again, I hope not spoiler alert here, but they came upon, I don't know what you'd call it, chateau, chalet, whatever, very palatial home that had been abandoned. All of those huge bedrooms with all of that lovely soft bedding and all of those beautiful clothes, and they chose not to sleep in them. They put their mattresses on the floor.
Yeah.
And
oh my gosh, they called it a castle. We actually know now where it is, and it was a big chalet, 3 levels, multiple rooms everywhere. And yeah, these girls, the 3 sisters and about 6 others who had run from the SS, they literally decided on that death march, no, enough, and just confronted the SS officer nearest them and said, shoot us if you want to, but we're going. And then when they did find this incredible chalet, and they established nobody was living there, that it had been abandoned. There was, mouldy food left in the kitchen and very, very musty. And I describe it how they described to me. They went in and looked around, looking for food. And they found a dining room that had this massive big dining table in it. And a local farmer came by to see, hey, who are you? What are you? He wanted to chase them away. And instead he took several girls back to his farm and gave them milk and cheese and some cured meat. And they brought it back. These girls had not sat at a table and chairs for over 3 years. And they still had that moral compass of, this is not our dining room. We can't just sit at somebody else's table. And then they decided that maybe it wouldn't matter if they took the table outside. So they opened the French door, she said, and they carried this large table outside and took the chairs outside and sat outside under the stars and ate their first meal as 3 girls in over 3 years. And yes, you're quite right. When it was in time and it got dark, they went upstairs to the bedrooms and that same moral compass kicked in. We can't sleep in these beds. Maybe they wouldn't mind if we took the blankets. So they took the blankets down to that dining room, now minus its table, and slept on the floor. They did make some clothes there, hand-sewed some clothes. I'm not even sure if I mentioned it there. They found stuffed in a closet some old drapes. Some old, disused drapes. And several of the girls got together, found scissors and needles and threads, and they created and made themselves a dress out of drapes. Very resourceful, aren't they?
Incredible. I think the other thing too that stood out for me was, and the shame of it, the way they were treated before they were rounded up and taken to Auschwitz by their neighbours and so-called school friends.
Yeah.
But then for them to survive and to come back, and they were still so poorly treated, even after going through all of that.
Some things didn't change. If you do look at the photos in the back, and if you're going to read it, have a look at the photo of Magda holding some silver candlesticks. I've held those candlesticks. And in the book, you'll read the significance of the candlesticks. Yes, to be once again, go to your home to find it's been taken over and you're now cast out. And then to go to Bratislava, where all the surviving Jewish boys and girls were coming back to, and still not be able to get work and somewhere to live, still being treated as second-class citizens. And this is actually that pivotal point in the girls' relationships where Livy, the youngest, took the lead. It was her that said, when something happened one day, enough is enough. We have to leave this country. And it was her that bullied Magda into going with her into the forest in the Czech Republic to train. It's called Hashara training. And that's when young Jewish boys and girls want to go to the promised land. It still kind of exists today. If you're wanting to go there and a Jewish boy or girl or not living in Israel, then you can also join what's called a Hashara group. You'll get different training, trust me. Probably just how to speak Hebrew if you don't know. But I remember Livy laughing at me and saying to me, they still made us go. She said when we said we wanted to go to Palestine, because it was Palestine then still, they said, oh no, you have to go and do training. What's training? She said. Well, we'll get together. There was probably, she said, 70 or 80 young boys and girls, out into the forest and you've got to learn survival techniques. And she rolls her eyes. She says, as if surviving in Auschwitz wasn't good enough. So I think they aced their survival for Shara.
It's incredible. One of the things that stood out for me, I guess in this day and age of celebritization and social media influencers and all the rest of it, where everybody is so hung up on who they are and their identity. The Germans did everything they could to strip these people of any sense of identity whatsoever, didn't they?
Oh, utterly. Hence the numbers. I'm not sure if you know everyone, but only Auschwitz had those numbers on the left arm. Only Auschwitz. If you ever see or hear of anyone who's got a tattooed number on their left arm, it could be either top or bottom, by the way, they were in Auschwitz-Birkenau, anywhere from a week, a day, to the years, like the girls were, and Lali and Gita were. There was another company, Dachau. They did some other little tattoo numbers on the wrist, but that was the same number everyone got. It was to identify them if they escaped, that they were an escaped Jewish prisoner from Dachau. So yes, there were other tattooing done or numbering done, but it was just the one thing. In terms of identifying a person by stripping them of their name and reducing them to a number, that was Auschwitz. Yeah.
Because for such a long time, Lali didn't even know what Gita's name was.
No. And then when he did find out her name was Gita, she didn't know her surname, because to her, what did it matter? I'm just a number. You should know. You gave it to me, she would say to him.
It also makes you conscious of all the little things that we take for granted, like being able to turn on a tap or being able to brush our teeth or whatever. And I love the little moment in Tattooist where he wants to ask Gita, can he give her a kiss? And she reminds him that she hasn't cleaned her teeth for a long time.
Simple things. I mean, when he told me that, and these are the things, yeah, look, I don't have the creative brain to make up, okay? These are just the throwaway things that he would tell me. And his throwaway things were said either in his apartment, at a coffee shop, going for drives, going to the movies. When he finally worked out that I was writing a screenplay, he kept saying, have you finished my book yet? You know, for months and months, I would say, no, Lali, and I'm not writing a book, I'm writing a screenplay. Well, that just went through to the wicket keeper. It was after many, many months one day, he kind of came up short and he went, well, what's a screenplay? And that was when I said to him, I want to see your book or your story as a movie. It's a film. And wow, you should have seen him get excited. A movie? You're going to make a movie about me? And I went, well, I'd like to. And then it was immediately, well, who will play me? I don't know, Lali. Brad Pitt's a good-looking boy. I'm a good-looking boy. He said, you get me Brad Pitt. So I pointed out Brad Pitt was too old. But then for many months, we went to every new release movie. It helped incredibly that said daughter, who we still had the eyes for, worked at Village Theatres in Melbourne. And so she would get us into every new release. And I would say, hey, this guy. And I'd get this, what are you thinking? Constantly. Until one day I took him to see a movie, and you'll all know what it is. It's got Ryan Gosling in it and Rachel McAdam. I took him there to see an actor called James Marsden. Tall, dark and handsome. He's you, Lali, he's you. Marsden comes on the screen. Lali kind of looks at me and goes, oh, what are you thinking? It's dark, but I know he rolled his eyes because he used to. But 10 minutes later, naked from the waist up girls, Ryan Gosling is on the screen. And Lali's on his feet. That's me. He should be me. He's screaming out to a packed theatre. I put him down and sit him down. 5 minutes later, he's up. You down the front, turn around and look at me. Don't you think he looks like me? So this went on for 30 seconds more, and then people started giving him a slow clap. They didn't want to tell the old bugger to sit down and shut up. He wasn't listening to me. And then he just turned to me at the slow clap and he goes, see, they agree with me. The movie was The Notebook.
Just hearing those stories that we don't normally get to hear about. You must feel immensely privileged to have had that man come into your life.
Utterly. Thank him every day. Thank him every day. I have a photo of him and I, amongst all my family photos. Look at it every day. I've now got one with me and Magda and Livy, same thing.
So when you're spending all of those hours with them, and there's so much to condense into this, and as you're reading the books, there's this feeling of being given these little snapshots through time of their time spent in Auschwitz-Birkenau. How hard is it to decide what to include, what to leave?
Oh gosh, that's the challenge of the decade, because there are so many stories that could be in there, but it would be the size of War and Peace.
So that was a success.
Not by a debut novel. And but many of them have similarities. And so it's a matter of taking, and maybe there are times when I actually have I've merged people together for sure, because you can't have all the players in Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm talking about the bad dudes, or even the good ones. And so there has been a merging of some of the characters and some of the things that played out multiple times. I'll just write about them once and create the story around it. Look, I'm then just so happy when I can come and talk to folks and share some of the other storylines that are not in there in the book. And that comes down also to the whole, the challenge of history and memory. It's got me into a little bit of trouble. I don't care. History and memory, isn't it great when they walk side by side? And I tell you, there are many, many times when they don't. I was told at an event once by a rabbi in Sydney that in Hebrew there is no word for history. No word. All their stories must come from the memories of those who lived and experienced them. So when I learned that was my light bulb moment of saying, because I was struggling with Lottie's story. I mean, you can't prove everything because the documentation doesn't exist. Nobody was there with a camera filming it to verify. But when talking to other Holocaust survivors, I hear them say, my story's the same but different. I was there. Sibby and Livy were in the same place at the same time, standing side by side, and yet they recount what they were looking at and witnessing, except differently. It comes with maturity. It comes with what your own background is. So that's when I decided I am not telling the story of the Holocaust. Never. The academics and the historians do that, and we're very, very grateful to them. I'm just telling a Holocaust story. And it's the memory of the person whose story I'm telling. So it was challenging with Livy and Sibby because they had different interpretations. Here's an example too of that with maturity. Of course it matters. Livy was 15, because this relates to Silke. So after I got to know her quite well and I was back in Israel with her, I said to her, I thought, I'll bring up the subject of Silke. So I asked her, do you remember Silke? And she put her head down. She said, of course I do. How could we not? That poor girl. I went, okay, what can you tell me about your knowledge of Silke? She said, she was in block 25 when we were 21. So they were in rows of 4. So we went down to 21, then 22, 23, 24, 25, right next door. Every day when we went to work, Silke would be just standing out there all alone, just looking so scared. She was my age. And I was so frightened for her. And she said, nobody spoke to her. I asked Sibby, she said, why don't we go and talk to Silke? Why does nobody talk to Silke? And she said, no, we can't go to block 25. And she said, well, why does she not go to work? We have to work. And Sibby said, well, she has to stay there because that's where the commandant can find her. So she said, I said to Sibby, well, what does he want her for? And Sibby said to me, well, he comes here to have sex with her. So I said to Sibby, what sex? She's 15. She said, I had no idea. Yeah.
Speaking of the baddies, one of the things that horrified me, and it's something that you don't see a lot of people touch on, is the fact that there were women SS who were perpetuating some of these terrible, terrible punishments and things.
Yeah, the two that I talk about in particular, and I give links in the back too if you want to know some more about them. And they were so bad, so evil. They were actually executed. They had war crimes and they were executed by the Allies because of their evil perpetuation of horror in there. Yeah, absolutely. They technically were there to run the women's camp, but they stepped outside those bounds as well. Yeah.
This has been an incredible journey for you. So what's next?
What's next? I mentioned a little while ago that I've written 4 books in under 4 years. I've said to my publishers, I love doing what I'm doing right now with you. This is my happy place. I want to be able to continue doing it because the world's opening up. I have my Qantas flight booked for the 11th of January, where I'll hit the US, then Israel, and then London, and then back to the US. But can I do my next book tour at a slower pace? All too often, you will fly me into Prague. You will stick me in front of a television interview straight away. You will have me talking somewhere in the afternoon and then somewhere in the evening. And hey, guess what? I wake up the next morning in Budapest and I do it all again. And then I'm in Vienna. And can we slow it down so I can take some time in some of the places I'm visiting and enjoy the scenery? Like I want to go to the movies here tonight. If my publishers were here with me, and the only reason they're not, by the way, is because Anastasia won't let them in because they're in Sydney. Yeah, they would have me doing something else. And so I'm going to do that. However, there is an arrangement for my next novel. I can tell you that it will be historical fiction again, same style of writing. Still a lot of research to be done. It is still set in the Second World War, but in a different theatre of war. Think Asia Pacific. And it's about nurses. Again, the answer.
Screenplays.
Thank you. Screenplays. Yeah, well, I'm a lousy screenwriter. I can confirm that because The Tattooist of Auschwitz it should have been on a small screen for you by now. It's being made into a 6-part miniseries for television. 3 screenwriters have written the 6 episodes, 2 each. And only COVID prevented it from being filmed like it was meant to have been filmed last year. And now there's a rethink on where it's being filmed. Poland was where it was meant to be filmed. Even the Polish government had given permission, which is very unusual for them. They kind of don't want to know too much about what was perpetrated in their country. As I say, it might have been Poland, but it was the German regime that ran those camps. So now there's still COVID sense problem. The makers of this know, because as I say, they're basically a big UK company that are behind it, but both the US and Spain and Germany and other countries are all part of it, that they're going to need a minimum each day of 200 extras. I mean, you take those 200 and then with technology, you create 100,000. But they still need a significant number. And the rules about making a COVID-safe shoot are quite complex. They have to literally build a village, and everyone has to live in that village, cast and crew, for weeks and weeks. We're doing it here in Australia and also New Zealand because we've got our act together. So the location of it is now being moved, still in the Northern Hemisphere. We need that, but yeah, it'll come.
Heather, I can honestly say it's been an absolute pleasure to have this chat with you this afternoon. Thank you so much. And it's been triply a pleasure having the chance to read these 3 books, to read the stories that you've shared with us. It's made an impact, not just on me, I know, but millions of other people, and certainly changed the way that we view what's happened as part of history, and not the anemic history that we learn in those boring history lessons in school. But thank you.
Look, thank you so much.